Welcome to the Dr. Harmony channel. Have you ever wondered if the hands that rock the cradle are eventually destined to be bitten by the very children they nurtured? It is a chilling thought, yet a reality for many. When children are small, parents are their entire world, their protectors and their providers. But as the years pass and the strength of the parents fades while the ambition of the children grows, a dark transformation can occur. For some, a parent stops being a hero and starts being a burden, or worse, a target. Today we explore a story that strikes at the heart of this betrayal. This is a tale of cold ambition, lost gratitude, and a family bond shattered by the lure of wealth in the heart of London. Let's dive into a story that will make you question how well you truly know those you share your blood with. The rain in London didn't just fall. It reclaimed the city in a cold, grey shroud that mirrored the silence inside the Sterling estate. Arthur Sterling sat by the window of his mahogany-lined study, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a glass of lukewarm tea. At 75, the man who had built a real estate empire from nothing felt like a ghost haunting his own hallways. He looked at the photograph on his desk. A grainy image of his son, Julian, and his daughter, Beatrice, laughing in the garden 3 decades ago. Back then, he was their titan. Now, he was a line item on a ledger they were eager to close. Arthur had spent his life ensuring they never knew the sting of poverty, providing them with elite educations and a safety net made of gold. But as he listened to the muffled, heated voices coming from the dining room, he realized that the safety net had become a noose. Julian, his eldest, stood by the fireplace, his designer suit sharp enough to cut glass. He paced the room with the restless energy of a predator. Beside him, Beatrice sipped a glass of expensive wine, her eyes fixed on the legal documents spread across the table. They weren't discussing their father's health or the loneliness he felt since their mother passed. They were discussing the efficiency of his assets. To them, Arthur was no longer a father. He was a bottleneck. He was a lingering obstacle to a multi-million-pound inheritance that they felt they had earned simply by existing. The betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, calculated erosion of respect. It started with subtle suggestions about downsizing and moved toward managing his affairs, a euphemism for stripping him of his autonomy. "He's becoming unpredictable," Julian whispered, his voice carrying a jagged edge. "Last week he spoke about donating a portion of the Chelsea holdings to a youth foundation. A foundation, Beatrice. That's our capital he's throwing into a black hole." Beatrice nodded, her expression cold and analytical. "He's losing his grip on reality. If we don't move now, he'll dismantle the legacy before we can secure it. We need the power of attorney, Julian. We need it signed before the quarterly audit." They spoke of him as if he were already dead, a piece of furniture to be moved or sold. In their minds, they weren't villains, they were merely protecting what was rightfully theirs. They had forgotten the nights he worked until dawn, and the sacrifices he made to build the very world they now sought to kick him out of. Arthur, standing just outside the door, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the London weather. The words, "power of attorney," rang in his ears like a funeral bell. He had suspected their greed, but the clinical nature of their plan felt like a physical blow. He remembered teaching Julian how to ride a bike, holding the seat steady so the boy wouldn't fall. He remembered Beatrice crying on his shoulder when her first business venture failed, and how he had quietly written a check to cover her debts without a single word of judgment. Now, those memories felt like ash. He realized that to his children, his love was a commodity that had finally depreciated to zero. The plan was already in motion. Julian had contacted a corrupt associate, a lawyer named Victor who specialized in family transitions. They weren't looking for a legal transfer. They were looking for a heist cloaked in legality. They planned to convince Arthur that his mental faculties were failing, creating a paper trail of confusion and lapses in judgment. Every time Arthur misplaced his keys or forgot a name, common occurrences for a man his age, Julian would exchange a pointed look with Beatrice, sighing loudly, making sure Arthur felt the weight of his decline. It was gaslighting of the most sinister kind, practiced by the people he loved most. They were building a cage out of his own vulnerability, and the door was about to swing shut. The gaslighting intensified over the following weeks, transforming the Sterling estate into a psychological minefield. Julian and Beatrice were masters of the subtle nudge. During breakfast, Julian would casually mention a conversation they had the night before, a conversation that never actually happened, about selling the summer cottage in Sussex. When Arthur looked confused, Julian would lean back, a mask of pity washing over his face. "Father, we spoke about this for an hour. Don't you remember? You even signed the preliminary intent." Arthur's heart would race. Was he truly losing his mind? He began to doubt his own shadow. Every time he tried to assert his authority, Beatrice would gently pat his hand, her voice dripping with a fake sugary concern that felt more like poison than medicine. "Rest now, Arthur. You're tired. The stress of the city is getting to you." Behind the scenes, the siblings were working with Victor to finalize a series of complex documents. These weren't just about healthcare. They were designed to strip Arthur of his voting rights in Sterling Enterprises. They needed his signature, and they needed it to look voluntary. To ensure this, they began isolating him. They dismissed his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, claiming she had been stealing from the pantry. In reality, Mrs. Gable was the only one who truly watched over Arthur, with genuine affection. With her gone, the house felt cavernous and hostile. The telephone lines were often unreliable, and Arthur's mobile phone mysteriously disappeared, only to be found days later at the bottom of a garden planter. They were cutting his ties to the outside world, making him entirely dependent on their version of reality. Victor arrived at the estate on a Tuesday, his briefcase filled with the instruments of Arthur's downfall. He was a man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a professional shock who had helped many impatient heirs accelerate their inheritance. They gathered in the library, the air thick with the smell of old paper and betrayal. Julian poured his father a glass of wine, piked slightly with a sedative to ensure the old man was compliant and foggy. "It's just a few updates to the estate's security protocols, Dad," Julian said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the desk. "With the new tax laws in London, we need to move the holdings into a trust to protect them from the government. You want us to be taken care of, don't you?" Arthur looked at the lines of fine print. The words blurred before his eyes. The sedative was working, making his head feel heavy like it was filled with wet wool. He looked up at Beatrice, searching for a glimmer of the daughter who used to bring him drawings of horses. He saw only a woman calculating the square footage of her new life. Is this what your mother would have wanted?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. Beatrice didn't flinch. "Mother would want us to be secure, Father. She wouldn't want you to struggle with these burdens anymore. Just sign, and we can all go to dinner as a family. Like the old days." The promise of a family dinner was the bait, a cruel reminder of the warmth Arthur so desperately craved. As Arthur reached for the pen, his hand hovered over the signature line. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, a survival instinct flickered. He noticed Victor's eyes darting toward Julian, a look of hungry anticipation. It was a look he had seen many times in boardroom negotiations when a rival was about to lose everything. The fog in his mind cleared for a split second. He realized that if he signed these papers, he wouldn't be taken care of. He would be discarded. He would be sent to a luxury care facility in the countryside, out of sight and out of mind, while his children liquidated the life he had spent 50 years building. He felt a surge of cold, sharp anger, but he knew he couldn't show it. He was outnumbered and outmatched in his current state. I can't see the lines clearly," Arthur stammered, purposely dropping the pen. It rolled under the heavy oak desk. "My eyes are failing me today. We must do this tomorrow morning, when the light is better." Julian's face darkened, the mask of the dutiful son slipping for a fleeting moment. "It needs to be done today, Father. The filing deadline is tomorrow." The urgency in Julian's voice confirmed Arthur's fears. It wasn't about protection, it was about a deadline. "Tomorrow," Arthur insisted, leaning back and closing his eyes, feigning a sudden bout of exhaustion. "I need to sleep. If I sign it wrong, it will be invalid anyway." Victor signaled to Julian to let it go. They didn't want a forced signature that could be contested later. They wanted him broken, not coerced. That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He waited until he heard the heavy doors of his children's guest wings close and the house fell into its predatory silence. He crept to his study, moving with a stealth he hadn't used in decades. He didn't turn on the lights. He used a small pen light to examine the documents they had left on the desk. His heart sank as he decoded the legal jargon. It was worse than he thought. It wasn't just a trust. It was an absolute transfer of all liquid assets and a voluntary commitment to a high-security memory care unit. They were planning to lock him away within 48 hours. He looked at the safe behind the painting of the Thames. His children didn't know the code. He had changed it months ago when he first sensed their shifting loyalties. Inside the safe was a burner phone he had kept for emergencies and a set of keys to a small apartment in East London they didn't know existed. He had bought it years ago, as a whim, a place to hide away when the pressure of the empire became too much. Now, it was his only lifeboat. He realized he couldn't fight them from inside this house. He was the king in a castle where the guards had been bought. To save himself, he would have to become a shadow. He began to pack a small bag, shaking with a mix of adrenaline and heartbreak. He was fleeing his own children, the very people he had lived for. The cold London air bit at Arthur's face as he slipped out through the servants' entrance, a door he hadn't used in 20 years. He didn't take the Bentley or the Jaguar. He knew Julian had installed GPS trackers on the luxury fleet months ago under the guise of elderly safety. Instead, he walked 3 blocks in the pouring rain, his expensive wool coat soaking through, until he reached a dimly lit taxi stand. As the black cab pulled away, Arthur looked back at the glowing windows of his mansion. He felt a pang of grief so sharp, it nearly took his breath away. He wasn't just leaving a house, he was leaving the illusion of a family. He was 75 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was truly homeless in spirit. The apartment in East London was small, dusty, and smelled of stale air, but to Arthur, it felt like a fortress. He sat on the edge of a narrow bed, the burner phone clutched in his hand. He knew that by morning Julian and Beatrice would discover his disappearance. They would panic, not out of love, but out of fear that their golden goose had flown the coop before the eggs were harvested. He needed an ally, someone they couldn't buy or intimidate. He dialed a number he had memorized long ago. Sir, Ethan, a former investigative journalist who owed Arthur a life-changing favor from a decade prior. "It's Arthur Sterling," he whispered into the phone. "My own blood has turned on me. I need to disappear, but first, I need to fight back." Back at the estate, the sun rose to a scene of controlled chaos. Julian had entered the study expecting to find a compliant old man, ready to sign away his life. Instead, he found an empty chair and a cold cup of tea. He checked the safe. The painting of the Thames had been moved. He let out a roar of frustration, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. Beatrice stood in the doorway, her face pale. "He's gone? How? He can barely walk to the garden without getting winded." Julian turned to her, his eyes wild with a mixture of anger and greed. "He's smarter than we gave him credit for. He's played us. If he reaches his old legal team or the press, we're finished. We won't just lose the money. We'll be social pariahs." They immediately called Victor, who advised them to play the concerned children card. "Report him missing," Victor instructed over the speakerphone. "Tell the police he's had a mental breakdown. Say he's delusional and potentially a danger to himself. If we can get a psychiatric hold on him, the power of attorney becomes a secondary issue. We can have him declared incompetent by a state doctor." It was a ruthless escalation. They weren't just trying to steal his money anymore. They were attempting to erase his personhood. Julian began the performance, calling the authorities with a voice trembling with rehearsed emotion, painting a picture of a father lost in the fog of dementia. Meanwhile, in the cramped East London flat, Ethan arrived with a laptop and a secure connection. He looked at Arthur, shocked by how much the titan of industry had withered. "They're going to hunt you, Arthur," Ethan warned, his fingers flying across the keys. "They've already flagged your bank accounts. Any swipe of a card and they'll have your coordinates. You're a ghost in a digital world, and they own the sensors." Arthur leaned forward, the fire returning to his eyes. "Then we don't use digital. We use the one thing they've forgotten about, the truth of the past. My children think they are the masters of the sterling legacy, but they don't know where the foundations are buried." Arthur explained that Julian and Beatrice hadn't just been greedy, they had been sloppy. In their rush to take over the company, they had engaged in several creative accounting practices to cover their own personal debts. Debts run up at high-stakes casinos in Monaco and failed tech investments. They had been stealing from the company long before they tried to steal it from him. "They think I'm the burden," Arthur said, a grim smile touching his lips. "But they are the ones who have been bleeding the empire dry. I have the audit trails hidden in a physical ledger at my old club in Mayfair. They never go there. They think it's a place for dinosaurs." The hunt was on. Julian and Beatrice hired a private security firm to scour the city, focusing on luxury hotels and private clinics. They never thought to look in a crumbling tenement in a neighborhood they wouldn't even drive through. As they searched, they spun a web of lies to the board of directors, claiming Arthur was incapacitated and that they were stepping in to stabilize the firm. The board, sensing a transition of power, began to shift their loyalty. The siblings felt the crown within their reach. They started planning the liquidation of Arthur's art collection, debating which pieces to keep and which to auction off at Christie's. But Arthur was moving too. With Ethan's help, he reached out to an old contact in the London Metropolitan Police, a man whose daughter's surgery Arthur had quietly funded years ago. He wasn't looking for an arrest. He was looking for a window of time. He needed to get into the Mayfair Club, retrieve the ledger, and present it to the one person the siblings couldn't manipulate: the Chief Justice of the Chancery Division, an old friend who valued the law above all else. The plan was dangerous. Arthur would have to step out into the open, a white-haired target in a city full of his children's eyes. He knew that if he were caught now, he would be drugged and locked away in a private asylum before he could say a single word. The tension in London reached a breaking point as the sun dipped behind the jagged skyline. Arthur stood at the edge of Mayfair, his collar turned up and a flat cap pulled low over his brow. This was his territory, yet he felt like an intruder. Every passing black car felt like a predator, and every siren in the distance sounded like a herald of his capture. He watched the grand columned entrance of his club, the Sovereign. It was a relic of an older world, a place where business was done with handshakes and leather-bound ledgers. He knew Julian's men would be watching his usual haunts, but they expected him to arrive in a limo, not to emerge from the shadows of a side alley like a common vagrant. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive tobacco. The porter, an elderly man named George, who had seen Arthur every week for 40 years, didn't blink an eye at his disheveled appearance. In this world, loyalty was quiet. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," George whispered, ushering him toward the private lockers. "Your son's associates were here an hour ago. I told them I hadn't seen you in a month." Arthur gripped the man's arm in silent thanks. He reached his locker and pulled out the heavy, cloth-bound ledger. This wasn't just a book. It was a map of every lie Julian and Beatrice had told. It contained the original bypass codes for the company's offshore accounts his children had been raiding to fund their extravagant lifestyles. As Arthur moved to exit, his burner phone vibrated. It was a message from Ethan. "Move now. They've tracked the taxi you took to East London. They know you aren't in the apartment, and they're widening the net. Julian just filed for an emergency welfare check with the police. They've labeled you at risk and delusional." The walls were closing in. Arthur knew he couldn't go back to the flat. He had to reach the Chief Justice's residence in Belgravia, but the streets were crawling with private security teams hired by his own flesh and blood. The betrayal stung anew. His children weren't just looking for him. They were hunting him like a wounded animal. Meanwhile, Julian was losing his composure. He stood in the center of the Sterling Library, shouting into his phone. "I don't care what it costs. Find him! If he speaks to the board or a judge before we have those papers processed, we're going to prison, not to the penthouse." Beatrice sat nearby, her face a mask of cold fury. "We should have moved sooner," she hissed. "You were too busy playing the dutiful son. We should have drugged him and moved him to the facility weeks ago." The mask of civilization had completely fallen away. In the absence of their father's presence, they had become ghouls, fighting over the carcass of a man who was still very much alive. Arthur navigated the back streets, his lungs burning from the damp air. He reached a small park near Belgravia when a silver SUV swerved onto the curb, blocking his path. Two men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't police. They were recovery specialists Julian had hired. "Mr. Sterling, your children are very worried," one of them said, his voice a mocking imitation of kindness. "Let's get you into the car. We have a doctor waiting to help you." Arthur backed away, clutching the ledger to his chest. "I'm not going anywhere with you," he growled, but his legs felt weak. The months of stress and the night of flight were taking their toll. Just as the men moved to grab him, a heavy flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "Is there a problem here?" A voice boomed. It was a local beat officer, the one Arthur's contact had alerted. The redditstories agents froze. They couldn't afford a scene with the actual police. "Just helping an elderly man who's lost his way, officer," the agent lied smoothly. Arthur stepped forward into the light. "I am Arthur Sterling. I am perfectly fine, but these men are attempting to kidnap me. I'm on my way to a legal appointment." The officer, recognizing the name from the high-profile missing persons report but seeing the clarity in Arthur's eyes, hesitated. "I need you to escort me to the residence of Justice William Hargrove," Arthur commanded, the old authority returning to his voice. "If you do not, you will be answering to the Home Office by morning." It was a gamble, a flash of his former power. The officer, sensing the gravity of the situation, nodded. The redditstories agents retreated into their SUV, realizing that the game had shifted. They couldn't touch him while he was under the gaze of the law. But as the patrol car pulled away with Arthur inside, Julian was already receiving the update. He knew exactly where his father was headed. The final move was being prepared. Julian called Victor. "He's going to Hargrove. If that ledger gets into the justice's hands, the audit trail will destroy us. We need to intercept them at the gate. And Victor, make sure the medical team is there. We need to prove he's having a total psychotic break the moment he steps out of that police car. No more talking. We end this tonight." The siblings left the estate. Their hearts hardened into flint. They were no longer just greedy children. They were predators closing in for the kill, ready to sacrifice their father on the altar of their own ambition. The police car pulled up to the iron gates of Justice Hargrove's residence, but the scene was far from the sanctuary Arthur had envisioned. Two ambulances were parked haphazardly across the driveway, their blue lights pulsing like rhythmic bruises against the elegant stone walls. Julian and Beatrice were already there, flanked by Victor and a team of men in white medical coats. As the officer opened the door for Arthur, Julian rushed forward, his face a masterpiece of practiced agony. "Father! Oh, thank God!" he cried out, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Officer, please, be careful with him. He's had a severe episode. He thinks he's being hunted. It's the late-stage dementia. Paranoia is a common symptom." Arthur stepped out, clutching the ledger so tightly his knuckles were white. "Stay back, Julian," he warned, his voice steady despite the exhaustion rattling his bones. The medical staff moved in a semicircle, attempting to herd him toward the open doors of the ambulance. One of the doctors, a man with a cold clinical gaze, held a sedative needle partially hidden behind his clipboard. "Mr. Sterling, you're safe now," the man said. "We just need to get you to the clinic for an evaluation." The police officer looked back and forth, confused by the conflicting realities. On one hand, he saw a dignified old man. On the other, he saw two distraught children and a professional medical team with official-looking paperwork. "I am not going to any clinic," Arthur declared, turning to the officer. "I am here to see Justice Hargrove. My children are attempting to commit me to silence a fraud investigation." Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes brimming with fake tears. "Officer, he's been talking about frauds and conspiracies for weeks. He doesn't even recognize his own grandchildren anymore. It's heartbreaking. Please, let the professionals take him before he hurts himself." Victor stepped up, handing the officer a folder. "This is a temporary emergency committal order, signed by a private physician. It's all legal and binding." The officer sighed, looking at the papers. In the eyes of the law, a signed medical order carried more weight than the protests of an elderly man in a rain-soaked coat. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, but if the doctors say you need a checkup, I have to let them do their job." The medical team moved in. Arthur felt a hand grab his shoulder, the grip firm and unforgiving. He looked at Julian and saw the truth behind the mask, a flicker of triumphant malice. His son was smiling. The betrayal was complete. They were going to drug him, take the ledger, and he would wake up in a padded room, stripped of his name, his wealth, and his freedom. Suddenly, the heavy front door of the mansion swung open. Justice William Hargrove stood on the threshold, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, his eyes sharp and judgmental. "What is this circus on my doorstep?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the quiet street. Julian tried to pivot, his tone shifting to one of deep respect. "Justice Hargrove, I'm so sorry for the disturbance. Our father has had a mental collapse. We're just taking him to get help." Hargrove looked past Julian, locking eyes with Arthur. He had known Arthur for 40 years. They had sat in the same boardrooms and shared the same vintage ports. He saw the desperation in Arthur's eyes, but he also saw the clarity. "Arthur," Hargrove said, ignoring Julian, "what is that in your hand?" Arthur raised the ledger. "The truth, William. The reason my children want me sedated. It's an audit of Sterling Enterprises. It shows exactly where the missing £20 million went, into offshore accounts held by Julian and Beatrice." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The word audit acted like a cold wind, chilling the medical team's resolve. Julian's face went pale. "He's rambling, Justice. He doesn't know what he's saying." Hargrove stepped down the stairs, his presence commanding silence. "Then let him ramble inside. If he's truly unwell, I'll call my personal physician. Until then, these ambulances will leave my property, or I'll have the commissioner here in 10 minutes. The medical team, realizing they were now facing a high court judge instead of a confused old man, began to retreat. They were paid to kidnap, not to challenge the judiciary. Victor tried to interject, but one look from Hargrove silenced him. "And you," Hargrove said to Victor, "I know you're firm. I'd be very careful about your next move." Julian and Beatrice stood frozen on the sidewalk as the police officer, now realizing he had nearly been a pawn in a family coup, escorted Arthur into the house. The gates swung shut with a heavy metallic clank, leaving the siblings in the dark, their plan unraveling in the London rain. Inside the study, Arthur collapsed into a leather chair. He felt the weight of a century on his shoulders. Hargrove poured 2 glasses of brandy and sat opposite him. "They really tried it, didn't they?" the judge asked softly. Arthur took a sip of the brandy, the fire of it warming his chest. "I gave them everything, William. Every advantage, every luxury. I thought love was a foundation you built upon. I didn't realize that for them, it was just a ladder they could kick away once they reached the top." He opened the ledger, the ink of the betrayals laid bare. "I don't just want my life back, William. I want justice, for the man I was and for the children I thought I raised." The silence in Justice Hargrove's study was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. Outside the gates, the shadows of Julian and Beatrice had vanished into the night, but the air remained thick with the residue of their malice. Arthur sat huddled in his chair, the brandy doing little to soothe the cold realization that his own children had viewed him as nothing more than a vault to be cracked. "They won't stop, Arthur," Hargrove said, flipping through the pages of the ledger. "You've wounded their pride and threatened their freedom. People like Julian and Beatrice, when cornered, become truly dangerous. This ledger is a death warrant for their reputations." Arthur looked at his friend, his eyes weary but sharp. "I don't care about their reputations anymore, William. I care about the truth. They tried to erase me. They tried to turn my own mind into a prison." As they pored over the documents, the scale of the deception became even clearer. It wasn't just the £20 million. Julian had been leveraging the Sterling estate to take out high-interest loans from unscrupulous lenders, shadowy figures in the London underworld who didn't take kindly to delays in repayment. Beatrice had been using company funds to prop up a failing fashion line, masking the losses with fraudulent invoices. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. They needed Arthur out of the way, not just for the inheritance, but to hide the fact that they were drowning. By 3 a.m., a plan was formed. They couldn't simply go to the police yet. Julian still held a significant amount of influence within the company's internal security and IT departments. If Arthur moved too early, they would wipe the servers and destroy the digital counterparts of the physical evidence. "We need to lure them into a trap," Hargrove suggested, his legal mind working like a precision engine. "They think you're hiding here. They think they have time to regroup. We're going to give them exactly what they want. A chance to settle this quietly at the office tomorrow morning. We'll call an emergency board meeting." Arthur felt a tremor of fear. "If I walk into that building, I'm in their territory." Hargrove smiled grimly. "Not if you walk in with a court-appointed auditor and a team from the fraud squad. But they can't know that. We'll tell them you're ready to negotiate the power of attorney in exchange for a quiet retirement. We'll use their own greed as the bait. They won't be able to resist the prospect of a total surrender." Arthur nodded, though his heart was breaking. He was setting a trap for the children he had once tucked into bed. He remembered Beatrice's 5th birthday, how she had hugged him and whispered that he was the best daddy in the world. Now, he was preparing to send her to a prison cell. The next morning, Julian received a call from Justice Hargrove's office. The tone was formal, almost apologetic. "Mr. Sterling, your father has had a moment of clarity. He realizes the toll this is taking on everyone. He's willing to sign the documents at the Sterling Tower this morning, provided you agree to a private settlement regarding his personal care." Julian's heart leaped. He looked at Beatrice, who was pacing the floor of their hotel suite. "He's folding," Julian whispered, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "The old man has finally broken. He wants to negotiate. We meet at 10. They arrived at the Sterling Tower, a glass and steel monolith that overlooked the Thames. Feeling like victors, they had Victor with them, along with a revised set of documents that were even more restrictive than the first. They entered the boardroom on the 40th floor, expecting to see a defeated Arthur. Instead, they found him sitting at the head of the long marble table, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking every bit the titan who had built the empire. Beside him sat Justice Hargrove and 3 men in nondescript gray suits who didn't look like lawyers. "Sit down, Julian." "Beatrice," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the vast, sterile room. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, professional detachment. Julian hesitated, sensing a change in the atmosphere. "Father, I'm glad you've come to your senses. Let's just sign the papers and get you the medical attention you clearly need." He slid the power of attorney form across the table. Arthur didn't even look at it. Instead, he opened the ledger he had brought from the club. "Before we discuss my health, let's discuss the health of the company. Let's discuss the £6 million moved to a shell company in the Cayman Islands last Tuesday." Beatrice's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about. That's an architectural investment." Arthur turned a page. "And the $4 million used to cover gambling debts at the Grand Casino. The ones Julian signed for using a forged signature of my executive assistant." The room went deathly silent. Julian lunged for the ledger, his mask of the dutiful son shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Give me that, you're delusional. This is all part of your breakdown." But the men in the gray suits stood up, blocking his path. One of them pulled out a badge. "Financial Crimes Unit, Mr. Sterling. Stay where you are." The boardroom, once a symbol of the Sterling family's untouchable status, had become a cage. Julian stared at the badge of the financial crimes officer, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The arrogance that had sustained him for months evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. Beatrice slumped into a chair, her hands covering her face, the wine-fueled bravado of the previous nights replaced by the cold reality of a looming prison sentence. Victor, the lawyer who had orchestrated the legal theft, quietly tried to edge toward the door, but the third man in the gray suit stepped firmly into his path. "You'll want to stay for the presentation, counselor," the officer said dryly. "You're a lead character in most of these chapters." Arthur didn't look away. He forced himself to watch the collapse of his children's composure. It was a masochistic exercise in closure. "I spent 40 years building this name," Arthur said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble. "I thought I was building it for you. I thought that by giving you everything I was protecting you from the darkness of the world. But I see now that I was just feeding the darkness inside you. You didn't want a father. You wanted a carcass." He pushed the ledger toward the middle of the table, where the investigators began to cross-reference the entries with digital files they had secured from the company's mainframe in the hour before the meeting. "This is all a misunderstanding," Julian stammered, his eyes darting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, as if looking for an escape. "The money, it was a temporary bridge loan. We were going to put it back. We had to move fast on some opportunities, and you were being so slow, so cautious." The excuse was pathetic, the logic of a gambler who had finally run out of luck. Arthur shook his head slowly. "You didn't just take the money, Julian. You tried to steal my mind. You tried to convince me I was a madman so you could lock me away in a room and wait for the clock to run out. That isn't business. That's a betrayal of the soul." The investigators didn't waste time. "Mr. Julian Sterling, Miss Beatrice Sterling, and Mr. Victor Vance, you are being detained for questioning regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit a felony," the lead officer announced. The click of the handcuffs was a sharp, metallic punctuation to the end of an era. As the officers led them toward the private elevator, Beatrice finally looked up. Her eyes weren't filled with remorse, but with a burning, concentrated hatred. "You think you've won, Arthur?" she hissed, her voice distorted by venom. "You're an old man in a big, empty house. You have your money, but you'll die alone. We were all you had, and now you have nothing." Those words hit Arthur harder than any of the financial betrayals. He watched the elevator doors slide shut, the image of his children in restraints etched into his retinas. The room was suddenly very quiet. Justice Hargrove walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did what was necessary, Arthur. They would have destroyed the lives of every employee in this building to save themselves." Arthur nodded, but he didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man standing in the ruins of a collapsed cathedral. He had saved his company, and he had saved his freedom, but the cost was the total destruction of his legacy. He spent the rest of the day in a daze of legal briefings and administrative handovers. He had to fire dozens of staff members who had been complicit in Julian's schemes, and he had to issue a statement to the press to stabilize the company's stock. By the time he returned to the mansion that evening, the rain had stopped, leaving London under a canopy of cold, indifferent stars. He walked through the front door and was greeted by silence. There was no one to welcome him, no one to ask how his day was. The house, which had once been filled with the sounds of his children's laughter and the warmth of his wife's presence, now felt like a mausoleum. He went to the kitchen and made himself a simple sandwich, eating it at the small wooden table the staff used. He couldn't bear the vastness of the formal dining room. As he sat there, he thought about the story Beatrice had told him when she was 6, a story about a king who lived in a castle made of sugar. "The rain will melt it, Daddy," she had said, "but don't worry, I'll build you a new one." He realized then that the castle had been melting for a long time, and he had been the only one trying to hold up the walls. The new one his children had built for him was a prison, and he had narrowly escaped it. The phone on the counter rang. It was Ethan. "The news is breaking, Arthur. The tabloids are having a field day. Sterling's siblings stripped of Silver Spoon. They're calling it the betrayal of the century." Arthur looked out the window at the dark garden. "Let them call it whatever they want, Ethan. To the world, it's a scandal. To me, it's just a tragedy." He hung up and walked up the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing on the marble. He stopped in front of the door to Julian's old bedroom, which had remained largely unchanged since he was a teenager. He pushed it open and saw the trophies on the shelf. The old school books, the remnants of a boy who had once looked up to him with genuine awe. Where did that boy go? When did the sun turn into the saboteur? The days following the arrest were a blur of flashing bulbs and sensational headlines. "The sterling shame!" screamed the front pages of the London evening papers. Arthur remained sequestered within the walls of the estate, a prisoner of a different kind. He had won the legal battle, but the emotional fallout was a radiation that permeated every room. He found himself wandering into the garden, staring at the oak tree where Julian had once fallen and scraped his knee. He remembered the sheer terror he had felt as a father, rushing to scoop the boy up, whispering that everything would be okay. Now, Julian was sitting in a remand cell, and Arthur was the one who had put him there. The corporate world was equally unforgiving. The board of directors, many of whom had been ready to side with Julian when they thought he held the power, were now falling over themselves to pledge their loyalty to Arthur. It disgusted him. He saw the same opportunistic glint in their eyes that he had seen in his children. They didn't care about justice. They cared about the stock price. Arthur sat through the meetings like a stone statue, his decision sharp and clinical. He dismantled the departments Julian had corrupted and liquidated the failing ventures Beatrice had used as her personal piggy bank. He was pruning the tree, but he knew the roots were already rotten. One afternoon, a week after the boardroom confrontation, Victor's replacement, a stern, ethical woman named Sarah, entered the study. She carried a letter from the prison. "It's from Julian," she said softly, placing it on the desk. Arthur stared at the envelope for a long time after she left. His hand trembled as he eventually tore it open. He expected a plea for forgiveness or perhaps a confession of regret. Instead, the pages were filled with a vitriolic defense. Julian blamed Arthur for everything. "You never gave us real power," the letter read. "You kept us on a leash, making us beg for every scrap of the empire. We didn't steal from you. We took what was ours by right of survival. You loved your balance sheets more than your own blood, and now you can spend your remaining years counting them alone." Arthur crumpled the paper and threw it into the cold fireplace. The delusion was absolute. His children had convinced themselves that their greed was a form of justice, a rebellion against a father who had dared to live too long. It was a common symptom of a generation raised in the lap of luxury, without ever understanding the weight of the labor that created it. They saw the harvest but had no respect for the winter. He realized that his greatest failure wasn't his business acumen, but his parenting. In trying to shield them from the hardships he had faced as a young man, he had accidentally raised monsters who lacked the capacity for gratitude. The isolation began to take a toll. Arthur stopped answering the phone. He stopped eating in the dining room. He spent his nights in the library, reading the same books over and over, trying to find some logic in the wreckage of his family. He began to have vivid dreams of his late wife, Eleanor. In the dreams, she was always standing at the end of a long hallway, her face obscured by shadows. "What did we do wrong, Eleanor?" he would cry out, but the dream always ended before she could answer. He felt a profound sense of guilt, wondering if he had worked too much, if he had been too distant, or if the wealth itself had acted as a slow-acting poison on their hearts. One evening, a surprise visitor arrived at the gate. It wasn't a lawyer or a journalist, but Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper Julian had fired to isolate Arthur. She stood there with a small suitcase and a Tupperware container of the shepherd's pie Arthur had always loved. "I heard what happened, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a warm balm in the cold house. "I figured you might need someone to keep the dust away, and someone who doesn't want a piece of your company." Arthur nearly wept as he let her in. For the first time in weeks, the house felt a little less like a tomb. As they sat in the kitchen, Mrs. Gable spoke with the blunt honesty that only an old friend can provide. "You can't fix them, Arthur," she said, watching him pick at his food. "Some fruit just rots on the vine, no matter how much you water it. You gave them the world, and they decided they wanted the stars too. It's not your cross to carry anymore. You've done your duty. Now you have to decide what's left for you." Arthur looked at his calloused hands. "What's left, Mary? I'm 75. My children hate me. My company is a reminder of my failure. I have everything and nothing all at once." "You have the truth," she replied, "and you have the power to do something they never would. You can use what you built to help people who actually deserve it." The seed of an idea began to grow in Arthur's mind. He realized that the Sterling legacy didn't have to end with the betrayal. If Julian and Beatrice wanted to treat his wealth like a weapon, he would turn it into a shield for others. He stayed up late into the night with Sarah, the new lawyer, drafting a plan that would change the future of the company and the City of London. It was a plan that would ensure his children never touched a single penny of the Sterling fortune, even after he was gone. The transformation of Arthur Sterling began not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet, devastating set of signatures. While Julian and Beatrice sat in their respective cells awaiting trial, they were still operating under the assumption that their father's wealth was an inevitability, a prize that would eventually fall into their laps once the unpleasantness was over. They didn't understand that Arthur was no longer interested in preservation. He was interested in a clean slate. Under Sarah's guidance, he established the Eleanor Sterling Foundation, a massive charitable trust focused on elder abuse prevention and youth mentorship in the city's most neglected boroughs. "I want the liquid assets moved by the end of the week," Arthur instructed, his voice regaining the steel that had once made him a legend in the City of London. The real estate holdings in Mayfair and Chelsea are to be sold. Every penny is to be funneled into the foundation. I'm keeping the East London apartment and enough for a modest life. The rest goes back to the world. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of awe and concern. Arthur, you're stripping yourself of the very empire you spent your life building. Once this is done, there is no going back. Your children will be effectively disinherited from the capital. They disinherited themselves the moment they tried to steal my mind, Arthur replied, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. They viewed my life as a transaction. Now, the transaction is closed. The news of Arthur's great divestment sent shockwaves through the financial world. It was a move of such radical altruism that many in the press speculated it was another sign of his mental decline. But those who saw him in person knew better. He looked younger, lighter, as if the weight of the gold had been what was truly crushing his spirit. He began to visit the youth centers he was funding, sitting on plastic chairs and listening to the dreams of children who had nothing, yet possessed a gratitude his own children had never known. Meanwhile, the legal walls were closing in on Julian and Beatrice. The evidence in the ledger was undeniable. The creative accounting they had used to fund their vices was laid bare in court. During the preliminary hearings, Julian tried one last time to play the victim. He stood before the judge, his hair unkempt and his expensive suit wrinkled. "My father is a tyrant," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He drove us to this. He made us feel like we were nothing. We were just trying to secure our future." But the judge, having seen the evidence of the attempted medical kidnapping, remained unmoved. The public, too, had turned. The story of the wealthy heirs trying to institutionalize their father for his bank account had become a cautionary tale for the modern age. Beatrice took a different approach. She sent Arthur a series of letters, each one more desperate and manipulative than the last. She claimed she was pregnant, then claimed she was terminal, then claimed she had found religion. Arthur read none of them. He had Sarah return them to the prison unopened. He knew the pattern now. She was fishing for a weakness, looking for the soft spot in his heart that she had exploited for decades. But that part of Arthur had died on the night he fled into the London rain. He realized that sometimes the only way to love someone who is destructive is to let them face the consequences of their destruction. The trial was swift, with Victor turning state's evidence in a futile attempt to save his own career. The siblings were convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The sentencing was a grim affair. As the judge read out the terms, 10 years for Julian, 7 for Beatrice, Arthur sat in the back of the courtroom. He didn't gloat. He didn't even feel relieved. He felt a profound sense of mourning, as if he were attending a funeral for people who were still breathing. Julian looked back as he was being led away, his eyes searching for one last spark of paternal mercy. Arthur simply nodded once and walked out into the sunlight of a London afternoon. He spent the following months moving out of the mansion. It was a slow process, sorting through decades of memories. He donated the art collection to the National Gallery and the library to a public university. He kept only the small things. A watch Eleanor had given him, a few old family photos from the years before the greed took root, and the key to the East London flat. Mrs. Gable helped him pack the last of the boxes. "Where will you go now, Arthur?" she asked as they stood in the empty hallway. "To the city," he said. "To the people who don't know my name, but might benefit from my work. I want to spend my last years being a man, Mary, not a monument." The Sterling Tower was rebranded. The name Sterling was removed from the facade, replaced by the emblem of the foundation. The business was now run by a board of trustees, with Arthur acting only as a silent advisor. He had effectively erased his own name to save his soul. One evening, as he sat in his small East London apartment, he watched a news report about the foundation's new community center. He saw a group of teenagers playing basketball on a court he had paid for. their laughter echoing through the television speakers. For the first time in years, Arthur Sterling smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. He had lost his children, but he had found his humanity. The final days of the Sterling saga were not marked by the cold marble of a boardroom, but by the warm light of a setting sun over a small community garden in East London. Arthur Sterling, now a man of simple habits and a quiet heart, spent his mornings tending to the soil. The city's noise felt distant here, a low hum that no longer dictated the rhythm of his pulse. He had traded his tailored suits for wool sweaters and his empire for a sense of purpose that no bank account could ever provide. His wealth was gone, distributed into the hands of those who built, those who learned, and those who protected the vulnerable. The very things his own children had forgotten to value. In the quiet of his new life, Arthur often reflected on the paradox of parenthood. He had spent decades believing that love was a structure built of security and luxury. He had thought that by clearing every obstacle from Julian and Beatrice's path, he was proving his devotion. He realized too late that by removing the struggle, he had removed the soul. Without the need to earn, they had lost the ability to appreciate. Without the need to sacrifice, they had lost the capacity for empathy. They had grown up in a world where everything was a right and nothing was a gift. And in that vacuum of character, greed had grown like a weed in a neglected garden. News from the prison reached him occasionally through Sarah, who remained his only link to his former life. Julian was struggling, unable to cope with a world where his name carried no weight and his demands were met with indifference. Beatrice had retreated into a shell of silence, refusing visitors and clinging to the bitter delusion that she was a martyr of her father's ego. Arthur listened to these reports with a heavy heart, but he no longer felt the urge to intervene. He understood now that mercy without accountability is just another form of enabling. He had saved them from the world their entire lives. Now he had to let the world save them or break them as it saw fit. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur received a surprise. A young man named Leo, who had been a recipient of the Eleanor Sterling Foundation's first scholarship, came to visit. Leo was the son of a single mother from a rough estate, a boy who had worked 3 jobs just to keep his books dry. He sat with Arthur on a park bench, his eyes bright with a future that Arthur had made possible. "I just wanted to say thank you," Leo said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "You didn't just give me money for school. You gave my mother a reason to stop worrying. You gave us a life." As Leo spoke, Arthur felt a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't felt in 40 years. This was the gratitude he had searched for in the eyes of his own children. This was the legacy that mattered. It wasn't about bloodlines or naming rights. It was about the ripple effect of a life lived for something greater than oneself. He realized that while his biological family had failed, his human family was thriving. He had lost a son and a daughter, but he had gained 1,000 children who would carry his values, not his name, into a brighter future. He was no longer the king of Sterling Tower. He was just Arthur, a man who had finally learned the true value of a pound. As the years passed, Arthur's health began to fade, but his spirit remained clear. He was often seen sitting in the Foundation's library, reading to children or sharing stories of the old London with anyone who would listen. He was a man at peace, a man who had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged not with a grudge, but with a mission. He had proven that even when those we love most turn against us, we have the power to define our own ending. His story became a whisper in the halls of the city, a legend of the man who gave it all away to find what really mattered. On his final day, Arthur sat by the window of his small apartment, watching the rain dance on the glass. He wasn't afraid. He looked at the photo of Eleanor on his nightstand and felt a sense of completion. He had fixed the legacy. He had turned a story of betrayal into a story of hope. He closed his eyes, the sound of the London rain lulling him into a deep, final sleep. He left behind no mansions, no fleets of cars, and no warring heirs. He left behind a city that was a little bit kinder, a foundation that was a little bit stronger, and a lesson that would echo long after his name was forgotten. Thank you for following this journey with us on Dr. Harmony. This story serves as a powerful reminder that while we cannot always control the hearts of our children, we can always control the integrity of our own. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming tales of human resilience and justice. Your support helps us keep sharing these important lessons with the world. Until next time, stay grounded and keep seeking the truth.